Making It Work is brought to you by the Max Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Theological Seminary and the Theology of Work Project.
Welcome to Making It Work.
Through conversation, scripture, and stories, we invite God into work's biggest challenges so that you can live out your purpose in the workplace.
I'm Mark Roberts.
And I'm Leah Archibald. And this is Making It Work. Speaking up, especially when you're not in a position of authority, is not easy. When you're in a lower position, there's a big incentive to keep your mouth shut. But sometimes that's not right for you and it's not right for your company. So how do you know when to speak up? And how can you do it effectively? Our guest today is Joi Freeman. Joi is a strategist who has worked with brands such as the YMCA, Claire Stores Inc., the Girl Scouts, MoneyGram International, and Burger King. Recently, she founded Remnant Strategy, which is a consultancy working at the intersection of culture and business to counsel brands through the process of mapping the next and best chapter in their story. Over her career, Joi has needed to make some tough decisions about when to speak up and about how to do it. And today, she educates young professionals about speaking up and managing up. Welcome to the show, Joi.
Thank you. Thank you, Leah, for having me.
Well, we're so grateful that you're here this morning. So, Joi, when you speak with young professionals, the topic of managing up comes up again and again. Why do you think you get this question so often?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges with professionals is they're coming out, especially young professionals, coming out of what has really been a flat organization their entire lives. So school, whether it's primary, secondary, college, at most you have a 4 or 5 year difference between where you are and who's around you. And so coming into the professional realm, I think part of it is figuring out your identity and your role and this new position that you're in, but then also what does that mean to enter into this space and what does it mean to have a voice when you are now in an environment where people are 40 years older than you and have significantly more experience than you, and there are more levels than you've experienced ever in your life.
When you put it that way, it does seem incredibly tricky to navigate. I remember when I was coming into the workforce in my first job, it just felt like I didn't know which way was up. No matter what, I was learning how to land on my feet, run my own finances and, work a job and live in a city far from my parents. And to think of how do I participate in a culture that's very different than all the cultures I've experienced beforehand, that's actually very tricky.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's kind of like being a rookie in a game that you've never really played, and determining where exactly in that game and on the field you fit in, and when you're supposed to swing the bat or throw a ball or kick a ball. Like all of those things are new concepts when you're coming in.
And maybe you don't even know the rules.
Exactly.
Gosh, it does sound hard. So can you give us a real life example from your own career of the time that you faced this and needed how to figure out how to manage up?
Sure. One of the ones that really comes to mind when I think about having to manage up and navigate this is actually midway in my career. And I was in this position where I had significant exposure, even though I was pretty junior on the team. And I was now at a place where I was sitting in meetings with executives, the CEO of the organization. So at this point, I was at a large global organization, and I was in a lot of the meetings representing my department. And in one particular time, it felt like a distinct Daniel moment in that we were sitting in a meeting with our CEO, and the team was trying to make decisions about how to move forward with a new initiative and how much it would cost to make this quick decision that we needed to act on within a matter of days. And I recall the CEO, who was known for demanding and expecting that he get responses as soon as possible, including in meetings. And there was a unique point in the meeting where he turned to me and he asked me my opinion on pricing that would impact the decision that we were moving forward with. And I just didn't know. And he pressed again for me to tell him how much it would cost for us to make this rush delivery and rush decision. And again, I wasn't confident in the decision that I was going to make in that moment. And so I did something that was pretty taboo. And I told him that I could either give him an accurate answer now, or if he gave me a little while, then I could go back and I could find an answer that I was more confident in, and help him make the right decision on how we move forward. That was unheard of. There were people who were senior executives who had never pushed back in that way. And actually, that was a turning point in my relationship with the CEO, because he came to respect that what I had to say wasn't because I wanted to save face, but it was because I wanted to really provide the best answer and solution possible. And after that, he came to really trust what I had to say and actually look for and seek out my opinion.
You called that, this is something you slipped in, you call that a Daniel moment.
Yeah.
What is the link for you between that and the story of Daniel in the Bible?
When I think about Daniel, he was, all of the, the satraps and all the wise people around him were looking to just provide an answer. And they were used to having all of these kind of tricks in order to push through what sound good. Daniel was willing to stand firm. One, he was willing to stop and he was willing to pray with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for the wisdom to give the right answer. And he knew that it was a risk. But even in that, you see throughout the book of Daniel that Daniel stood firm in his perspective. He stood firm in what God had called him to do, even if it was at risk of his own life. And I think a lot of times throughout your career, we have those Daniel moments where we have to decide, are we willing to be like the wise counsel of, quote unquote, wise counsel of everyone around us who just says what leaders want to hear, or if we're willing to stick our neck out.
Wow. Mark, how does that resonate with you?
It's funny. I'm now sort of reminiscing about all of these times early in my career. So my first sort of full-time job was working for a fairly large church, and the pastor there was an extremely influential and highly regarded pastor. And I not only worked under his authority, but then I had a boss who was under him. So I was, 3 down. And I just remember this feeling of sitting in meetings, trying to decide whether to say something or not, and sort of calculating on the one hand the risk of, ticking off my superiors or being perceived as being, unsupportive. At the same time, the risk of not speaking, and then, things that I might have seen happen in advance, that aren't good would actually have happened, and then I'd feel responsible, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm living into that tension, Joy, that you talk about, because, there's no, at least I don't know, there's not a super clear playbook that says, okay, this time speak, this time better to hold your tongue. And actually the feeling I have is one of anxiety, as I remember kind of what that's like. And Joy, I think your example is an inspiring one, both because of what you did, which was gutsy, because the CEO could have just said, okay, enough with you. But it was also, I also admire that CEO for the willingness to see that you were a person of honesty and integrity who could really contribute. And, that was good. And so on both sides, good on you both.
So Joy, how would you counsel, let's say Mark is one of the young people that you speak to in your seminar, how would you counsel him about, either explain what are the things that hold you back from speaking up, or what are the things that help you move forward when it is time to speak up?
Early in my career, I was known as the person who spoke up about everything. And it has become no less terrifying to speak up. But what I have learned over the years is this importance of scarcity and quality. And so the concept of scarcity is that the more scarce a resource, the more valuable it is. For me, in speaking up, that means I don't need to speak up every time something is bothering me, or I have a perceived challenge with something. I really need to step back and evaluate what value do I bring, to speaking up? And what value do I bring to the issue? And if I don't say something, then what happens? And really, I've had to learn how to negotiate what it means to speak up and what is the reason. I think a lot of times there may be issues that personally are concerns for us, but it may not be a major issue. Whereas other times, it's worth speaking up because this could be detrimental to whether it's the reputation of the organization, the reputation of the team around you, whether it's for me, sometimes speaking up, particularly working in marketing, has been the need to speak up because I'm not in a very diverse environment and we are pushing out marketing campaigns that could be culturally offensive. So again, the value to the organization or the value to the team is I want to make sure that we aren't at reputational risk. Whereas younger in my career, I could be at times a loose cannon when it came to speaking up.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing from you is that having a little internal, like speaking up checklist helps you in the managing up portion of it. Like speaking up all the time doesn't necessarily help you managing up. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And I think when it comes to speaking up and managing up, again, I think of people like Daniel, who I think did a really good job of understanding what was the implications of what was happening around him. Even when I think about Nehemiah, again, that was more of a personal issue with speaking up, but there was something that he felt compelled and called to do. And the king, his boss, recognized that there was an issue. And so that was when he took the time to speak up about it. So I think part of it is really knowing who you are and knowing what your threshold is. I think for me, part of it is knowing if I don't speak up, will I be able to sleep at night? Is this something that I feel like I will regret not speaking up about? And then if I do speak up, then in the long run, is it really worth it at this point? And again, what value does it bring to the people who I'm managing up with? And I think even just knowing from that perspective and positioning it from the perspective of the person you're communicating with is incredibly important.
I love just to tease out the story of Daniel. I just thought you just gave me an insight so interesting about Daniel because he, really did take a stand for his beliefs, but not in a speaking up sort of way. When he heard about the injunction against praying to God, he didn't, go into the middle of the square and say, you guys all stink and I'm going to pray to my God anyway. And, you guys are taking Babylon in a really wrong direction. He didn't do that. He went into his room and prayed in the same way that he had been doing before. Yeah. And only when, it was others in authority who brought it to a head. There were others who accused him of praying in his room, and then he was drawn before the king. That is when, he defended his position. There's a very interesting temporal play of when it is that he took a stand, how he chose to do that in order to, win over the king, who ended up saying, the God of Daniel, woohoo, saved him from the lion's den. I don't know. Mark, help me out here. Do you have any reflections on the book of Daniel? This idea that I'm bringing up?
I think, every situation has its distinctive pieces, but what is clearly applicable is exercising wisdom and, as Joi said, not just using every opportunity to blast away. I mean, Joi, what you described about you is where I began. I'm sure in my first staff meetings when I was at the church, I talked way too much. And now I'm probably almost the other extreme in that I sit and listen a lot and find that to be very valuable. And I think to learn to listen well, to, really, as you said, Joi, think through, is this an important contribution, or is this just my sort of overestimation of my own value and input? Or is this a really, as you said, a really key issue? And so you really have to weigh, is this the time to stand up or not? And we need God's wisdom. We need help. We need wisdom from others.
And with Daniel, it really was an ethical issue that he had to decide, how to manage up to the king about. Joi, how do you feel speaking up and managing up interacts when it's an ethical issue?
I think that is, again, where you have to know your threshold and your internal convictions. So again, Daniel is a great example of speaking up and knowing that there is a risk. And I think really being willing and ready to take that risk. But again, it goes back to knowing when to speak up and what's the value of what you're saying. And this has happened across my career, where talking about or determining whether to speak up about issues that were ethical. One that is really unique and ties into this idea of having very senior level leaders and speaking up is actually, I was at a symposium, and it was CEOs from across the country that were connected to the company in which I worked. It was a symposium about poverty and inequity, and how inequity is often connected with race and a lot of the social implications that happen with poverty. And the conversation turned to talking about Department of Labor, and there was a push for a change in wages at the time. And one CEO in particular was talking about the challenges and frustrations of having this possible wage change, and while simultaneously talking about the challenges of how do we work towards preventing poverty. And I had this moment where I felt this rush to say something, and then I had this moment of complete fear and said, I'm not going to say that. Mm-hmm. And then I don't know what came over me, but the next thing I know, I was talking. and to this group, there were about 60 people at the symposium. I talked about, I said, we are here and we're talking about the challenges of subsidies and people who have to go on food stamps and all of these things that we see happening in society and the social safety nets, while simultaneously talking about the frustrations of having a wage increase. But I think we need to understand that we live in a world today where CEOs make 400 times what their employees make. So if we're really serious about what we're here talking about today, then CEOs need to be willing to cut their salary so that their staff have a fair and livable wage. And again, I'm saying this to a group of CEOs. I was pretty sure that I would need to pack up my desk, or it'd be packed up for me by the time I got back to Chicago, because there was this moment of silence where no one said anything. And then eventually one CEO spoke up and said, she's right. We have to really think about how we contribute to this issue that we are here saying that we want to solve. So that was a time where it was very risky. I think I have had to learn the art of delivering a bold message without trying to be offensive. And I think Jesus is really good at that. He was good at saying the truth in a clear way, but not saying it in a way that was intentionally offensive to the audience. So they were offended by the message, but they weren't necessarily offended by the messenger.
Joi, it's obvious to me that you are able to say hard things without being too emotionally engaged to say them in inappropriate ways. I mean, I was thinking of my own case a couple years ago. I was in a meeting where I was not the leader. My boss was in the room and several people, colleagues, and a presentation was being made by an outside group. And I was getting really angry with them. I really thought they were not being honest, and I was bugged and not managing that very well. I spoke out and I said things that were true, but I completely lost the room. And I actually lost the ability to influence the decision. The decision was made in the other direction. Turned out I was right, but my inability to speak in a way that was, calm and helpful completely blew that thing. And so I appreciate the way you're talking, because it's obvious you can talk about some pretty significant things in a way that allows people to listen and respond. And that has a whole lot to do with your sort of managing of yourself. You mentioned that earlier, knowing yourself and being self-aware. And I just want to acknowledge that because that's hard to do, and that's the kind of thing that develops over time. Although I must admit, this thing I did a couple of years ago, I've been working, for 40 years, and I'm still learning. But there's it seems such an important piece. If people are going to hear you and not just react against you.
Yeah, but you said a key word there, and it's influence. And I think no matter where you are in your career, you can have the power of influence, even if you don't have a positional authority. And I think that is something that's critically important for people to learn early in their career, is that influence is not contingent upon your level. Influence is about how you carry yourself and people's willingness to listen to what you have to say and believe and follow. And that can happen at any level in an organization.
Now, Joi, what were you doing in that moment that allowed you to get through to those CEOs? Were you channeling some sort of spiritual practice that you had been working on for years up to that moment?
I don't know. I think, so I spend a lot of time in prayer. I spend a lot of time really trying to read the scriptures from the perspective of a professional. And I have, I think, what I call biblical mentors. So people in the Bible and go-to books that I use. In that moment, I think at this point in my career, and this was only a few years ago, I'm at a point where I know my passion, I know my interest, but I've also have continuously worked on the craft and the art of exposing what needs to be exposed in a way that allows people to engage in the conversation and not feel shame. And I think that was probably what was at work in that moment, was lovingly helping us see how we have the potential to be hypocrites and how we have the potential to contribute to an issue that we believe legitimately have a passion about solving. But the issue wasn't that the issue can't be solved. The challenge is that we have to be willing to take risks. And that was more so what I wanted to point out in that. And I think that came from a heart and a desire and a belief that people, for the most part, want to do good. We just at times, it's kind of like sin. You know what Paul talks about, he doesn't want to sin, but it pulls him in. And it's the same thing with these types of decisions, particularly ethical ones, I think at times, is that you want to do right, but you're accustomed to what is comfortable to you. And sometimes you just need someone to help you call that out in a way that doesn't bring shame.
So you had to take a risk yourself in order to get these CEOs to see maybe they needed to take a risk to make some real progress towards the change that they were talking about.
Yes. And I think personally, because I've spent so much time studying Daniel and Nehemiah and Joseph and Esther, I think I walk into my roles and my career, and even now with having my own consulting business, with the perspective that I'm here and in this place because God has allowed me to be here. And so in every situation, I am praying through, well, what am I supposed to be in this situation? And I think that also helps to your earlier point about knowing when to speak up and when not to speak up, because it may not be my purpose for that particular role. My purpose may be something else. And for me, it's about staying centered in what is my purpose in this position.
And those are all characters in the Bible who really did need to manage up in their own individual circumstances. Yeah. Joseph and Esther and Nehemiah and Daniel all had a message from God that they needed to carry, but none of them were in the position of power in their situations.
Yes.
And you also mentioned another biblical example, which is Jesus, which is a funny biblical example to mention when you talk about someone not having power, right? Because he had a considerable amount, being the Son of God. But he often did not have the, positional authority in terms of society's view of him in the situations that he was speaking into. So is there like an example from the gospel that really stands out to you of the way that Jesus, influenced other people around him?
I think there's so many amazing examples. One that really comes to mind is the stoning of the adulterous woman. And I think, Jesus in that moment was able to, he did not deny, he didn't address whether what she did was right or wrong. He was able to pivot and focus on, but how are we to respond? And who of us has a right to respond?
Right.
And I think,
and for our listeners who maybe the verse doesn't jump to their mind, I'll jump in and say we're talking about John chapter 8. And this is a scenario where a bunch of religious leaders who are going to stone this woman to death for adultery. And Jesus, he doesn't yell at them or say, you can't do that. He does something very odd. He like stoops down and he writes in the dust. And then he says, the person who is without sin should cast the first stone. And let the person who doesn't have any sin themselves throw the first stone at her. And then everybody leaves. So anyway, continue. Sorry to interrupt you, but I want so we're all on the same page. We're talking about this very odd scenario in the Gospel of John where Jesus gives a message to the religious leaders around him in a very unconventional way.
Yes, and what I've heard in a sermon at church was that the law at that time was that both parties should have been brought to the center, to the court, and stoned. And so, in a way, he's calling out that if you're going to do this, then you have to do it according to the law. And the crowd was responsible for making sure that both parties were punished for what they did. And so in many ways, the crowd in convicting the woman was also being disobedient to the law. And I think Jesus is very eloquent and simple in how he challenges everyone. And again, that's an ability to understand the situation, to read the room, to read the people who are in the room, and really understand and know how to navigate the situation. And I think that's an art, but it's also an amazing character trait to have, and one that I think is extremely beneficial for people who want to have influence, even when you don't have position.
I hear a couple of practical tips coming out of the way that you analyze this scripture. I hear simplicity in the message. I hear eloquence. I hear reading the room. Are these kind of on your top 10 list of tips that you give people for managing up effectively?
They are. I mean, when I talk with young professionals and even the staff that I have managed over the years, it's those. It's also being having empathy. I think at times when we need to manage up and also manage difficult challenges, we don't do a good job of really thinking about it from the other person's perspective. And I think that goes a long way. The other part of it is I've had to learn in managing up is that the people who I report to, their job is not exclusively to manage me. And so how do I manage up and think about managing up in a way that accounts for that I am a sliver of what they are thinking of on any given day?
Man, I so appreciate so much of what you're saying, and your biblical examples, Joi, I think are really strong. Many years ago, I actually wrote a commentary on Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So I've thought a lot about those people, and I didn't talk about managing up. Makes me want to go back and revise some. But again, you got me thinking. So I just think okay, so one of the things you said, Leah asked, are there practices in your life to help you do this? You mentioned the practice of prayer. And I thought immediately of Nehemiah in the beginning of his book. As you know, he hears that things in Israel are terrible and Jerusalem is terrible. And he's terribly upset. Now, he works for the king of another empire. So he's a close servant of the king. And he hears that his homeland is in deep trouble. And so he's very upset about this. But what it says in the book is that he spent several days fasting and praying and asking for God's help and God's wisdom, first off. Then, he decides he's going to actually confront the king and ask, confront's too strong, approach the king and ask for this extraordinary favor. And part of what I love in the text is at one of the points he said, when the king asked him what he wanted, he said he was really afraid. So he prayed, quietly just on the spot. And it's just such a great example of a managing up situation that was so tender, but I think it completely underscores your point, Joi, that in prayer and in this case taking time to really sort it through in prayer, he was given, on the one hand, the clarity of what he needed to do and needed to say. At the same time, the awareness that he really needed God's help in his quote unquote secular workplace, right? Mm-hmm. So I love your examples, and the Jesus one too is great, because sometimes we think of Jesus as just sort of blasting away at the Pharisees. Sometimes he blasts away. In other cases, like the one you mentioned, it's a very different approach to communication.
Yeah. And I think the other one is being able to manage up in disappointment. And Caleb and Joshua, they're a great example of that. They were right. And they then had to suffer, you could say, for 40 years because the other 10 didn't see it their way.
Right. And this is from Numbers chapter 13, when Moses sends the 12 spies into the land that God promised them and says, check out this land and give us back a report. And Caleb and Joshua say, yeah, we should totally go in and take over this land. We can take these guys. And the rest of the 10 are like, no, they're too scary. We can't go into the land and take them. So that's what you're talking about. So tell me what your personal reflection is on Caleb and Joshua, Joi.
I've been spending a lot of time studying Caleb and Joshua and what it means to have a pulse on the situation, and how do you navigate that when no one else sees it. And part of that, as with a skill set as a strategist, I am often seeing situations ahead of with the organizations I'm working with or consulting with. And I think it can almost at times feel like the prophets who no one understood or listened to. And so I've spent time studying the prophets, but also Caleb and Joshua, because I think that the challenge in that is being sure that you are right and being able to see things from God's perspective, but having to live with the disappointment when you have it right, but the decision is opposite of the direction you recommended. And I think there is a tendency to want to say, see, I was right. But then when you're in the middle of it and you're in the desert, that's not really what everyone needs to hear. And so I think what I am learning in this stage is, how do I consult? How do I advise? How do I navigate situations where it may be clear to me the direction that we need to head, but also do it with a level of grace that I can rest assured knowing that I have done everything I can do, but also have grace to myself and to the organizations and teams that I'm working with, that I don't need to, that in the end, God has the ability to course correct. And I think we see that at the end of what happens, once they actually enter the promised land.
So how do you do that, Joi? How do you continue either to manage up or to manage your own emotions in that state of disappointment?
Well, it's a work in progress. But again, I spend a lot of time praying. I mean, there is no strategy that I have done that I have not prayed over. So my work at the YMCA, and when I repositioned youth development, and all the work we did in creating a platform around anti-hunger, that was all through prayer. Those were all strategies that came because I really prayed about where we should go. The same thing when I worked with Claire's. When I started at Claire's, I spent time reading the book of Nehemiah because I had an impossible challenge ahead of me. And so when things don't work out, one, I have my Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's around me, the people who I can call and pray with, other professionals who are also believers, who can be there when I'm having the really difficult times, and also who can remind me of the victories I've had in the past. And I think that's incredibly important. That's one of the beauties of the book of Daniel, is I think it's a great book for young professionals to really see what it means to have kind of your small group or your discipling group of fellow young professionals, and what it looks like to pray through the difficult times. So I think for me, because I spend so much time in prayer about where I'm headed and about the things that I'm doing. And I have people who know these things very well. When it doesn't work out the way that I hope, or the way I envision or know what could be successful, then I'm able to go back and say, well, God, I did everything I could. So, now it is out of my hands. And I think having that peace is also really important. And again, I have not mastered it, but that is always the direction I'm moving towards.
Joi, I just struck as you've been talking, and at one point, Leah had asked you about, things that help you do this. And you're really connecting classic Christian disciplines to your daily life in the workplace.
Yeah.
So scripture, you have many examples and are making those connections between scripture and work. You mentioned prayer several times and praying through everything having to do with your work. And you mentioned also community and the community of support. And, many Christians have those things in their lives, but I also think many haven't made the connection that you've made so just naturally and beautifully into your work. And that's going to help you not only in terms of managing up stuff, but all kinds of stuff as you are really living your faith in such a way that it has everything to do not just with your sort of your personal life, your family life and whatever, but with the stuff you're doing at work in whatever context. And I just think that's a great encouragement that you're a great example of that. And I'm glad for your sharing this.
Thank you.
The last question that I want to ask both you, Joi, and Mark is you're at points in your career where you have had opportunity to manage other people. Do you have examples, when other people have, either disagreed with you effectively or, swayed your behavior or decision making effectively? What does that look like from a manager's side?
So I would say I prefer not to manage and I prefer to lead. And I think that those can be two distinctly different things. So for me, as I started to lead and lead large teams, I spent a lot of time studying what it meant biblically to lead. And for me, it's about taking all of the talents and skills that I am responsible for and the people that are on my team and giving it focus and nurturing it so that we are moving in the same direction toward the goal. And I think that when I do that, I have teams that feel comfortable challenging my perspective, and I welcome that because I don't know everything. And so it becomes less of a thorny situation, like a thorn in my side, and more about encouraging everyone at every level on my team to bring attention to the visibility that they have, because we're all at different places. So we all have different types of visibility. And I think that has helped a lot in making the people on my team feel valued and feel that they have purpose in the role that they're in. And it's helped me a lot in building strong teams that can work towards the goal, because it's also not on me 100%. It's a team, and we all have a responsibility and a role to play in being successful towards the goal.
I love that. Just a different way of seeing managing, leading, not managing. Mark, what about you from your experience leading and managing others? So has there been a situation where you said, wow, that person really influenced me really well?
Yes, and it's interesting because one of the things Joi said was something about, I know I don't have all the answers. And I think early on in my management or leadership, either way, I felt like I have to be the one with all the answers. And it wasn't because I was so filled with my sense of self-importance. It was more like, if I don't have all the answers, then I'm a failure and I'm not a good leader, not a good manager. So it was really hard for me to admit that I don't have all the answers. As I have now, and this is now about 30 years later in my life, I think, oh my gosh, I don't have all the answers. And there's some real freedom in that. And it's one of the things that, that I communicate with the people that I'm officially supervising, the team that I'm over, is that, there'll be some things I really care about, but there is so much I don't know. And for me, there's tons of freedom in that. Now, having said that, it still is tough. If I'm really committed to something, believe in something, and somebody on my team challenges that, I've got to deal with myself, my own defensiveness, my issues. And if I don't deal with myself well at that point, we have a problem. This is where I think Joi would encourage me to pray. And I know if I not stop the meeting and pray out loud, but I mean in the context of whatever situation I'm in, if I bring it before the Lord, that helps a lot for me to manage myself. If I don't, odds are it's going to be hard for me to be open, and then it's a loss for everybody. It's a loss for me because I'm not creating the team I want to create. It's a loss for the person who's pushing back on something, because that person has both a need to be affirmed, but also often great ideas. I just think the other thing I'd say, that what I've learned, and even right now, my team, Leah, one of my key colleague, whom I supervise, Michaela. I mean, she's extraordinary. I mean, if I didn't, she got to be on this call because she could probably tell you all kinds of ways she manages up that I don't even know. But what I know is
we'll get her on a follow-up interview.
What she brings is so incredible that I would be a fool not to be open to that. At the same time, there are occasions, I'll just be honest, where, she'll challenge something. And again, I've got to deal with me because I'm feeling defensive. I'm feeling unheard. I'm feeling whatever it is. So there's this, I think, a balance for a manager or a leader even, of being open, but also that dealing with oneself and knowing my stuff, so that it doesn't get in the way of my leading in the way I want to lead, building the kind of team I want to have, and having the kind of team relationships that I think are not only good for me but best for the organization.
I'm going to give each of us a chance to have like a last word. So if we're talking, imagine one of our listeners is facing a work situation like, I just don't know how to budge my boss. I just don't know how to, say this thing that I believe really needs to be heard in my organization. How do I even go about starting to figure out how to say it, to figure out how to phrase it, to figure out when? Let's go around the table and each of us can give like one piece of advice. And I'll start with you, Joi.
Yeah, I would say really take the time to take stock of what does it mean to have influence? And that is largely understanding the situation and the people who are around you, and really thinking through how to talk from their perspective and not from your agenda.
I love it. Mark, do you have one gold piece of advice?
I really like Joi's. There's a lot of wisdom there. But let me underscore something I said earlier, and it really was, paraphrasing something Joi had said, that although it sounds just so obvious in a way, the discipline she talked about that help her, do the kind of things she just said. I look at it from another person's perspective, see their interests. I mean, that's coming from this consistent discipline of scripture and prayer and community, that's making those connections into the workplace. So that I'm just so impressed that for Joi, that certainly makes a difference when it comes to these particular issues, managing up issues. But I'll bet you we could talk about all kinds of other things. We could talk about visioning. We could talk about strategy. We could talk about structure. And I'll bet you, Joi, that you would have a very similar kind of integration of where your faith really informs your work. And I just want to acknowledge that, and it's inspiring. It's good to be reminded. I'm glad to be reminded, and I expect that that'll be true also for our listeners. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
So Leah, what about you?
I totally agree. If I have one takeaway from this conversation, it's pray. and which sounds so simple, but we often forget. I often forget in the context of my own work. I think my workplace problems are so big. I think my communication problems, are so big that I can't possibly remember to bring them to God in the moment. And all of the heroes of Scripture that we've talked about have been people who paused and prayed before taking action in their job. So I feel really encouraged by that message today. Stop and pray and trust that God has the outcome in His hands. No, it's not just me figuring out how exactly I need to say this thing or manage my managers. It's God who is in charge of all of us in the end.
Well, and so what's so cool, because you're right, Leah, that does sort of sound sort of simple. So it's like, okay, we're Christians, we should pray, duh. I mean, what Joy's giving us is real life, nitty gritty examples from real leadership and management challenges. So it's not just the religious folk are saying, oh yeah, pray about it, but this is a great example of what that really means.
Joi, were you able to keep your job after speaking up to those CEOs? How did that all shake out in the end?
Everything was still on my desk when I got back to Chicago.
So there's hope.
Yeah. So there's hope.
For the person who manages up.
And actually, the other role where I spoke up to the CEO about waiting to provide input, later on, the president of my division actually promoted me because he said that he felt I was one of the people that he could trust what I said, even when he didn't agree with it.
Wow. Pretty good.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good outcome. I'll take that. I'm going to put that in my back pocket as a piece of hope. Not, success after managing up.
There you go.
Like it. Joi, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast together. This has really been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
That's our show. Don't miss the next episode. Be sure to subscribe.
And if you like what you've heard, please leave a review. We'd love to hear from you, and it helps other people find us. Thanks for listening.